Welcome back to the Brewer Fanatic podcast. This is Jack Stern, joined as always by my wonderful co-host Spencer Michaelis. We've got some news to break down for you on this one. We did an emergency pod last week to discuss the Devin Williams trade, but there were a couple of other moves that happened before that decision as well that we have to go over. Plus, Major League Baseball coming out with a study about pitcher injuries. We're going to talk about that too towards the end of the show. So not specifically Brewers on that one, but we have a lot of stuff coming your way within the next few minutes. I say minutes, even though this is going to be well above an hour in runtime. But before we jump into all of that, Spencer, how are you doing this evening?
I'm doing really well. Sounds like you're doing great too. You called me wonderful today. Like we're really, you must be in the Christmas spirit or something. Things are off to a hot start. But no, I'm doing well. Definitely getting close to, I've got a nice week and a day or two break from work because of the holidays. We're off that whole time. So I am very much looking forward to that. And of course, spending time with family and everything else over Christmas, but mostly my time off is what I'm looking forward to. But yeah, otherwise everything's been good. How about you?
Can't complain. Has your day been enhanced personally? You said you were doing well. Has that been enhanced by the fact that you also got out of work early due to the snow?
Oh, yes, it was. It was enhanced by that. Big time thing for me. Yeah, I mean, it helped because traffic got pretty bad about halfway through, but I was at least already halfway home. So roads are rough right now. I will say that we are not getting much plowing done in the Milwaukee area. Whenever there's snow, it's pretty much just people running it over until you can see the ground. So, yeah, not very fun to drive in, but I'm here. I'm ready to podcast, so we're all good.
That's all we need. I was looking at like the forecast earlier in the week, and they were projecting, at least for where I'm at, I'm about half an hour north of you, but they were projecting like 1 to 3 inches of snow. And then I got up this morning and it was coming down pretty hard. So I checked my phone again and they had changed it to like 3 to 7. And I think we're going to be closer to the tail end of that by the time it's all done. But I also had the luxury of just, being able to work from home and doing all of my writing here at my wonderful podcasting desk that I now have set up in my little corner over here. But without further ado, we should probably dive into some actual baseball content here. As I mentioned before, we talked about Devin Williams going to the Yankees last week. In case you did not catch that episode, I would advise you go listen to that one because we give a little bit more in-depth breakdown of why the Brewers made this move, why we're okay with it, the return the Brewers got, what we think of Nestor Cortes, and what we think of Caleb Durbin. But I did want to just throw this in the agenda for this week in case either one of us had some new thoughts that we wanted to throw in there. I don't really have a whole lot to add personally. I don't think my view on the trade has really changed in the last week. I see you shaking your head, so I assume that you're kind of in a similar boat there.
Yeah, I think I've just been, as I look into Cortez more and more, I feel confident as long as he's healthy, he's going to be a really solid pitcher for the Brewers this year. But beyond that, just with a little bit more time to digest it, I think I ended up pretty much coming to the same conclusions we came to with only a couple hours to digest it. So, yeah, it hasn't changed much. I would definitely encourage you, if you haven't yet, to go listen to that one though, because we did break it down quite a bit more in depth than that.
I did look into Cortez a little bit more since we recorded that episode. And the more I look into him, I don't think I really talked about this on the last episode. He is a little bit interesting because I think we did say that in a way he kind of fits the Brewers mold and that he's not a big stuff guy, can be a little bit deceptive. A guy who throws a lot of pitches as well. That's something the Brewers have done well with in recent seasons. But the more I look into this and the more I kind of think about it, the way that he deceives guys is quite a bit different than what we see, first of all, from anyone in MLB, but especially anyone who's on this Brewers team. And this is what I ended up looking into more and writing about. I feel like when you look at a lot of these Brewers pitchers who are getting it done with deception or have gotten it done with deception, you're talking about guys who are making that happen because they're making everything look the same for as long as they can. I mean, you talk about a guy like Colin Ray, You talk about a Bryce Wilson or an Aaron Savali, even a Frankie Montas when he was here. Guys who are going to be super consistent with their mechanics. The release point is not going to change a lot from pitch to pitch. Everything's really consistent. The 3 fastball mix, you're throwing 3 pitches that, to the naked eye of a hitter, especially immediately after you release that ball, that spin is basically going to look exactly the same. And then as those pitches get closer to the plate, you're going to start to see them diverge a little bit and they're going to behave differently. These are all guys who are creating deception via consistency. It's consistency and sameness for as long as you can make that happen. And then the difference is coming late. The difference is coming as the pitch is getting close to the plate where you start to see them separate. Nestor Cortes is basically the opposite of that because he's creating a different look all the time before he even releases the ball. He's going to change his timing with his windup. He's going to change his arm slot. He's going to do everything differently right away. He's thriving because it's instant chaos. Everything's different right off the bat. He's not fooling you with making everything look super similar throughout 90% of the action of pitching the baseball, basically. It is kind of like a different way of doing it. And I do think that's something that the Brewers are going to have to take into account now that they've brought him onto this staff. He's not a guy who Chris Hook can coach in this way of, we're going to create deception by making everything look the same for as long as it can. I think there are still elements of that they can focus on. Like, I still think trying to figure out like a real sinker for him is a big one. The pitch that StatCast has classified as a sinker for him is basically just what happens when he drops down on his 4-seamer. When he drops down to kind of that sidearm delivery, that's going to kill a lot of the carry on the ball and it's going to add more run to it. So he doesn't actually throw a sinker or a 2-seamer. So I still think there's a good chance the Brewers try to add that to his arsenal. But outside of that, I think that's like the only Brewers-y thing that I think they're going to do to him, so to speak. Otherwise, I think they are going to recognize that in a lot of other ways, he's very different from everybody else that they have on this staff, and they're not going to really do anything else to him. I don't think they're going to move him around on the rubber. I don't think that outside of trying to add a 2-seamer, there's going to be a whole lot of changes to, the pitch shapes or the sequencing or anything crazy outside of, seeing if you can add that 2-seamer and then go for a little bit more even balance of the fastballs. I'm sure Chris is going to have some mechanical ideas to maybe clean things up, but I don't think he's going to get rid of the different looks and the messing with all of this stuff. I think if anything, maybe he cleans some things up with the way he moves that make it even easier and even more seamless to kind of slide into these alternate windups, these longer windups or quick pitch type windups, changing arm slots, all of this stuff. But it is interesting, like the more I looked at it, because yes, you think, okay, funky lefty without great stuff. Yeah, that could make sense for the Brewers. But then you also look at exactly how he does it and really what the funkiness is. In a way, it's not very Brewers, and it's going to be a little bit different to see a guy like that on the mound compared to, all of these innings that we've seen from guys like Colin Ray, Bryce Wilson, Tobias Myers last year, Frankie Montas, Aaron Savali, all of these guys, where it's more about how can we get things super controlled for as long as we can and then have the way we're manipulating the ball only show itself towards the end. Nestor Cortes is just kind of chaos on the mound, and I do think that's something the Brewers are going to have to embrace, and I think they will embrace it because they do want guys to be themselves. But they finally now brought in a guy, I think, where being himself is going to look quite a bit different than what we see for a lot of guys.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I hadn't really looked at it in that deep of a form, but like it is a different funkiness than what they've had for sure. I mean, if you go on YouTube and search up Nestor Cortes windups, you will find some of the most hilarious, interesting looking windups you can possibly have. And I know he did an interview with MLB Network. I think it was a day or two ago. And he just kind of mentioned that, he's hoping to kind of show some of these younger pitchers like different ways to do things. So it'll be interesting to see if the Brewers I think they're going to embrace it for him. I'm not 100% sure they'll embrace him showing it to all these other pitchers and whether they'll allow that. But I do wonder if it's something that, certain pitchers could pick something up on and bring a little bit more of the pre-pitch kind of deception to their delivery. There might be some guys where that could make some sense, and maybe just changing up timing, even if it's not as ridiculous as what Cortes does, but just changing the timing a little bit, doing little things to try and mess with hitters even before they get into the same type of stuff that they always do for the Brewers. That could be interesting. That might be a little bit of a very secondary piece of the trade where, maybe he teaches some of these younger guys some of his tricks, but in the Brewers way at the same time. So yeah, that's a good point. It is something that I hadn't really considered just how he does it, but it is different. It's definitely different. And it's easy to see on video how it's different if you look it up. And I think most Brewer fans probably already knew that. That's kind of what he's known for. But even like I wasn't as aware of how often he'll drop down to basically sidearm and pitch. Like I knew he did all the windup stuff, but I hadn't really noticed that he was a guy who would change his arm slots as much as he does. So it'll be interesting. I'm gonna enjoy watching that. Like that's super fun to me. That type of stuff, just watching pitchers operate like that is always fun. But I am also certain that there are going to be some fans that when he does something like that and gives up a bomb, they're all just it's gonna be like, oh, why is he doing all this stuff? And it's what makes him him. So he's gonna keep doing that type of stuff. But that is a good point. We kind of lumped them in together with everyone else when really it's in the widest scope, it's kind of similar to what the Brewers look for a lot, but in reality, it's quite a bit different than what we've had in the past. Even like Wade Miley was my initial first thought, but that's not what Wade Miley is at all. Wade Miley is exactly what you talked about. He's let's throw a fastball on a cutter, start him in the exact same spot, and just break bats and get grounders. And that's not how Cortes is trying to operate. So yeah, it'll be. I am excited to watch him. I get more excited to watch him kind of every time I look into him and hear about him. But yeah, I guess that's how I kind of wrap up my thoughts on it. Durbin's always going to be, I think, the piece that people will think about the most long term for good reason. But I do think I'm going to enjoy the Nestor Cortes experience at least. So whatever that means to the rest of you, I'm having fun. So that's a good thing for me.
We did get a couple of questions about Caleb Durbin, so we'll get to those in a second. I just want to say kind of last note on Cortes here in response to something you said. When you talk about, would the Brewers be open to some of that funkiness and mixing timings and arm slots? Would they be open to having younger players try that? I think that's a smaller but still interesting discussion in and of itself, because I remember kind of talking to Chris Hook about this because Freddy Peralta down the stretch did start using 3 different leg kicks. Not started, he had done it before, but he brought it back down the stretch. And I was talking to Chris Hook about it on one of the homestands toward the end of the year. And he basically said, Freddie's so accomplished and I have such a good established relationship with Freddie that I kind of let him just, if he has an idea for something he wants to try, I'm almost certainly going to let him do it because he's got that rapport. He's got that experience. We have that trust. But then he said if Tobias Myers came to me and said he wanted to try the same thing Freddie's trying right now, like with the different leg kicks and all this stuff, he would say no.
Yeah.
Because Tobias is a rookie. He's less experienced. We just need to get you in a good spot to begin with here. And we're not going to try to overdo things. We're not going to try to change too many things all the time, like from pitch to pitch like this. We just want to keep it a little bit more simpler. So my guess is they're probably, if that situation presents itself, they probably would not be huge fans of Nestor Cortes, not necessarily teaching guys this stuff, but I guess more so guys trying to emulate what Nestor Cortes is doing, because he's not quite as accomplished as Freddie in terms of like the innings he's logged as a starting pitcher, but it is kind of a similar thing. He's been around for a little while and he's a veteran. He knows himself really well, knows his body really well, knows what he needs to do to succeed. So it is kind of a similar situation where it's like you trust a guy like that to just do all of this stuff that looks absolutely crazy. But my guess is if, one of these younger pitchers, whether it's someone like Myers or even like an Aaron Ashby or a DL Hall, if they were to try some of this stuff, I don't think Chris Hook would be very happy. I don't think he's going to give them the liberty to do that. But it is an interesting discussion to kind of have when we talk about that. If you don't have any response to that, we can kind of move on to talking a little bit more about Caleb Durbin. One of the questions that we got for this week comes from Lucas on Twitter, and he asks, what should we take away from Caleb Durbin having extremely pronounced reverse splits in his minor league career? Talked about how the Brewers seemingly have not shown that they really care about them a whole lot, or that they don't think they mean a whole lot. He points to Luke Voigt and Keston here as a couple examples of that. So he asks, is Durbin headed down that same path of being set up to fail? And I think Lucas is assuming that most of Caleb Durbin's playing time will be coming against left-handed pitching. So I did look up the numbers. We both did, actually. They are very, very pronounced. Lucas was not exaggerating when he asked this question. On the MILB.com, to my knowledge, you can't look at like a career split for a player, but if you just go season by season in the minor leagues, he doesn't have a ton of experience in the minor leagues. He rose pretty quickly through the system. But at just about every single stop every year, it's like a OPS well north of 800 against right-handed pitching and an OPS well below 700, usually in like the low to mid 600s against left-handed pitching, and Caleb Durbin is a right-handed bat. These kinds of questions are always tricky for me because I think I kind of feel similarly about reverse splits as Pat Murphy seems to, at least based on how he would describe it, especially when I asked him about it in spring training in early 2024. Basically, I think they are real. I don't think they're super common, but I think they're real because I do believe that there are legitimate reasons why a right-handed hitter could struggle more against a left-handed pitcher. And like the example that Murphy brought up in spring training when we talked about it was, if you have a guy who throws like a really good cutter to an opposite handed batter, like kind of up and in on him, that's a very, very challenging pitch for that hitter to get to. And I do think it was kind of similar for Keston Hiura. Keston Hiura wasn't facing a ton of lefty cutters, but Keston Hiura just could not hit anything elevated up and in. Anything hard, like not only elevated, but like up and in particularly. Lefties were very, very good at hitting that spot against him. And I'm guessing a lot of that came down to, if you're a left-handed pitcher and you're throwing a fastball that's moving arm side, if you try to pitch a righty inside, if you miss, you're probably not going to hit that guy. You're just going to have that pitch leak out over the plate a little more, versus if you have a right-handed pitcher facing a right-handed batter, if that ball's moving arm side, it's going into the batter. So if you miss inside, it's going to hit him. Versus if you're a lefty, that arm side run is going away from the batter. So if you pitch inside, a miss is more likely to just be a pitch over the plate as opposed to a hit batter. So I'm guessing that's part of the reason behind that. I think in Hiura's case, it was very, very real, and I think the Brewers should have noticed that, because there was something you could look at and be like, okay, there's very clearly something different about the way lefties are pitching him. They're good at exploiting what he can't hit. I haven't looked enough at Caleb Durbin's splits to know that for him, and now that's really tricky to do because some of the tools that we normally would have access to through Brewer Fanatic, we don't have access to those at the moment. So that essentially means that we can't go quite as deep on some of his heat maps and his splits as we otherwise would. I guess you could try using like Baseball Savant a little bit to look at some of that stuff, because they do have a minor league search tool, but it is a little bit more time consuming to do it that way. So I think that's worth looking into, because the splits are very pronounced. And when I see something like that, I'm not going to go so far as to say that it's a long-term problem that can't be fixed. But when you look at something like that, I do think there is something going on. I don't know exactly what it is, because again, I haven't looked nearly as deeply into it as you would need to look into it to know for sure. But yeah, when I see something like that, I am going to be alarmed a little bit that obviously there's something going on, that something needs to happen to fix this, I think. What exactly that is, again, it depends on, how much you know about it to even know what the problem is. But yeah, it's tricky for me to answer the question definitively. But depending on what the issue is, it's a very fair discussion to have. It's a very fair concern to raise because the Brewers do have a history of essentially just ignoring this stuff and seemingly writing it off as just kind of a fluke. And I'm guessing that's more of a front office thing than anything. But I would disagree with that a little bit. And that has kind of been the one area where I've pushed back a little more on the way the Brewers view things. Like I said, I think reverse splits are not super common, but I do think they are real because there can be real reasons why a guy would struggle to hit opposite-handed pitching more than you would expect. And to be honest, I'm going to try not to ramble too much here. I'll pass it over to you soon. For the amount of information that front offices have now, the amount of stuff we know, the amount of stuff we can track, it is kind of mind-blowingly reductionist to me for anyone to just look and say, well, that's got to be a fluke. We're not going to look into it a whole lot, and we're just going to write it off as a fluke and assume it's going to correct itself. Like, for as much information as you have, I understand there's a little bit of paralysis by analysis, but to just write that off as a fluke, and maybe they are looking into it a little deeper than I'm giving them credit for, but just the automatic logic that a lefty will always hit a righty better and a righty will always hit a lefty better, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. It feels like you're skipping some critical thinking that could go into that a little bit more than what you seem to be applying there, but that's just how I feel about it.
No, I agree with everything you said. I do think, and you mentioned this, and it kind of brought back something for me because I forgot that Murph talked about this a decent amount early in the season. It does feel like currently, at least from the coaching side of things, they do view it on a more of a like micro, like we're digging into what this hitter can do against pitchers, and it's less about like, do they hit lefties well? Do they hit righties well? It's do they hit this type of pitcher well? And I think as long as they're handling hitters like that, it's not as big a deal if they are legitimately doing that to form their lineups and everything. But I do think, just to answer the general question, I do think it's a little bit of a concern because I think for me, that was before this was brought up to me, this was kind of what I was expecting his role to be, was to be facing lefties on the infield, whether that was for an Oliver Dunn if the Brewers don't add anybody else, but even if it was for Bryce Terang against lefties, and say the Brewers did add a different third baseman and now he's kind of taking some at-bats against lefties away from Terang because Terang really, really struggles with lefties. I don't know how comfortable I would feel about him being a legitimate like platoon issue type or reverse splits type of guy, because I don't know that the at-bats against righties are going to be super available, and that kind of lessens his value. I think part of what I saw in some value was his potential to face lefties on the infield when there was going to be maybe, like I said, with Terang or even Dunn, there would have been opportunities for him to do that, and there still will be currently with how the roster is filling out. So I looked into this a little bit just to try to get an idea of like what the sample size is. In the minors, it's 201 at-bats total. So that's not small, but it's not a huge sample either. And I do think, just kind of along the lines of what you talked about there, I actually think lefties in general, I get that, lefty-lefty matchup is tough on left-handed hitters, but I also think that it shouldn't be assumed that righties will hit lefties well, because over the course of your baseball career, you don't face that many lefty pitchers. Like you really don't. It's kind of something where righties against lefty hitters have seen right-handed pitchers a ton over their whole career. So have most righty hitters. So I think you have more experience against how the pitches move against right-handed pitchers from both sides of the plate. And I actually think reverse platoon splits for right-handed hitters are a lot more common than people think they are. The Brewers bring them in all the time. So maybe I'm just only analyzing it based on what I see when the Brewers bring in guys, but they bring in a lot of guys who have hit righties better than lefties as right-handed hitters over the course of their career. Guys like Mike Brasso did not do that. And I should point out on the Luke Voit thing. I think he actually had normal platoon splits until like the year before he came to Milwaukee. He really struggled against lefties. So that's always going to be part of it. There is small samples noise to these types of things because they just don't face that many lefties. Nobody does. But it is concerning. And like Jack said, I think if we have a little bit more time to dig into it and figure out if there's a specific part of the zone that he's struggling with against lefties, like a Keston Hira, if there's a specific pitch, like to me, I wonder if he just struggles with changeups from lefties. That type of thing can always be that type of, that type of offering that goes away from you, that dies down a little bit. It's not something you usually see without the spin of a breaking ball. So it's just different on the eyes for a hitter. And it's, again, I just wonder how many times he's actually faced lefties throughout his career. Obviously, in the minors, he's done a decent amount, but I pointed out to Jack earlier, like he was also a D3 baseball player at one point. And don't get me wrong, D3s, I'm not knocking D3. I played D3, I coached D3, but it's not D1 in terms of the level of pitching that you're seeing. So even if he was seeing lefties a decent amount in college, it was nothing compared to what he sees in pro ball. So I just wonder if, I have concerns, I guess I should say, but I also wonder if as he gets more experience against lefties, if this is something that might just start to be kind of hammered out over time as he just gets to see these types of pitches more often. And like I said, a deeper dive might tell me, no, he's just got some pretty major holes in his swing against lefties or in his approach. But I do at least think that that should be under consideration, that there is a possibility that it's just he's never seen that many good lefties, and now he's trying to battle his way through pro ball, finally seeing good pitches from lefties. And as he gets more experience, we might see a little bit of an uptick in his production, but it does concern me overall. Like I hadn't noticed that. I probably should have looked at it because, again, the Brewers do this a lot. They bring in guys who have this reverse split, but it is a stark difference. It's over 200 points for his career based on just some mental math I'm doing as I look through the seasons. It has to be over 200 points different based on the last 2 years. It was over 800, 850 against righties, and then under 660 against lefties. And then it was basically the same the year before. And then he had 9 at-bats his first year in pro ball. So I'm not even worried about what that was, but it would be a bit concerning because, again, I thought that was going to be his role this year. So if that is a problem, then I don't know what his role really becomes. So I rambled a lot there, but it was something I had not noticed. And now it makes me a little, I guess if I were ticking, I would tick down the trade grade just a little bit if it is a problem, because I don't know what his role becomes then. I just had kind of penciled him in as that like lefty facing infielder, and I don't know what he is now.
Yeah, the Brewers picking up so many guys in recent years who have the reverse split as a right-handed hitter. Brian Anderson's another one that comes to mind as well. He had the reverse split coming into Milwaukee. Just with how many of these guys that they've scooped up in recent years, it still has me wondering if they think that they've identified some kind of market inefficiency where teams are avoiding these guys because they don't hit lefties very well, but the Brewers have reason to believe that's not actually a thing. So they think that by scooping these guys up, they're going to get like a bargain because these guys are going to suddenly hit lefties well. I don't know, but it's happened enough that it does kind of make you wonder. Final question we'll take on the Devin Williams trade here before we start moving on to some other moves. Brian sent us an email this week and he asked us, how would we have felt? And by we, I'm just going to pass this one off to Spencer because Spencer's the prospect guy. How would you, Spencer, have felt about the Williams trade if Clark Schmidt was included in the return rather than Nestor Cortes? I'll let you take it away.
Yeah, I mean, I would feel better about it. This would be, Schmidt dealt with some injuries this year. He was on the 60-day at one point, but he had a sub-3 ERA and a mid-3s FIP. Pretty solid strikeout to walk ratio. He's 28, so I think age-wise it's not too much different than Cortes, but in terms of control, he's a Super 2 arbitration guy, so he has 4 years of arbitration. He's heading into his second year right now. So just on that alone, you would have been getting 3 years of control of a solid pitcher. Again, somebody who probably slots into the top of the Brewers rotation at either 1 or 2, and you would have got 3 years of control for him. So yeah, I think it would have been a better trade if that were the case, but I also don't think that would have ever really been on the table. I would imagine the Yankees look at Schmidt as one of their main starters and going into next season. Obviously, they have quite a bit of talent, but he'd be at the back of their rotation and be quite good in that role. And I think from the Yankees perspective too, they were looking to get off of a left-handed pitcher because they just signed Max Fried. They have Carlos Rodon. I don't think they wanted necessarily 3 lefty starters. So my guess is it wasn't ever going to be on the table, but if it were, yeah, I would have preferred that over what we got in Cortes. But again, that's not really a knock on Cortes. It's more about the control and the fact that I think overall it'd be similar value that they would bring to the rotation this year.
Moving on now to some other Brewers moves. Before the Brewers traded Devin Williams to the Yankees, they made a pick in the Rule 5 draft. They selected Connor Thomas from the St. Louis Cardinals AAA team. So the Brewers, they have made some picks in the Rule 5 draft within the last decade. Wei Chung Wong is one that stands out from 2014. That was about 10 years ago. But then the more recent one they made after that was they acquired Gus Varland from the Dodgers in the Rule 5 draft. They ended up offering him back. Thomas is an interesting one for me a little bit because Spencer's got kind of his StatCast data profile up on the screen if you're watching on video right now, but he's not an upside guy. And I feel like when you see Rule 5 picks, a lot of times teams do go for an upside guy, especially like rebuilding teams that have the ability to give these guys a little bit more playing time. The Brewers are not a rebuilding team. They're a contending team. And Connor Thomas is not an upside guy. When I look at Connor Thomas, this looks a lot to me like the Bryce Wilson replacement. So he pitched mainly in relief in AAA in 2024, but he was a starter before that. He still had outings out of the bullpen in 2024 where he was going 3 or more innings, getting 9 or more outs. He made a couple spot starts as well. And again, it's like a deep arsenal that the Brewers like. There was a lot of sliders. That's probably his best pitch, and he kind of turned it into a little bit more of a sweeper in 2024, adding some more movement to it because it is a very high spin slider. So he's able to then use that side spin to generate more lateral movement. But then he's got the 3 fastballs the Brewers like, the sinker, the cutter, the 4-seamer. He's got a changeup that also has played really well in the minor leagues, but I kind of wonder if they might have him throw that less in the big leagues, especially out of the bullpen, because it does kind of blend with the sinker shape-wise. He's very much a guy who should probably be pitching at the bottom of the zone with that sinker because of the amount of depth it has on it. He's a big ground ball guy. He's not going to strike a ton of guys out. Strikeout rate was okay in AAA, but he's going to sit around 90 miles an hour, going to get ground balls, guy who could play up in front of this defense. But really, I just see the value being they are hoping he can give you bulk innings that are roughly league average or maybe a little bit below. The Brewers did say that they plan to stretch him out a little bit as a starter in spring training and see how that goes. That doesn't surprise me either because that's exactly what they did with Bryce Wilson.
Yeah.
Stretched him out if you need him. Otherwise, you're going to be our kind of jack of all trades, long man in the bullpen. That's kind of what I see happening with Connor Thomas. But Spencer, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's very easy to make the Hobie Milner type of comparison just in terms of like upper 80s, 2 different fastballs, but also changeup and slider are kind of the main secondaries. Obviously, Hobie kind of changed things as he went throughout his Brewers career. But actually, speaking of that, he just signed with the Rangers like 3 minutes ago. I saw on my phone. So shout out to Hobie finding another major league home. It sounds like, and Bryce Wilson signed with the White Sox yesterday. So
was it a big league deal for Hobie?
It was they said a 1-year deal, which to me doesn't sound like a minor league deal. They would normally say it was a minor league.
That'd be an MLB deal then.
Yeah. So
good for him.
Yeah, good for him and Bryce Wilson. They both found major league homes, and I kind of think that's the combo here is like a Bryce Wilson, Hobie Milner kind of Frankenstein mix here with Connor Thomas, and I agree with you. I think it's interesting that they went for the guy. Like you said, it's normally you're going for ceiling with these Rule 5 picks. Like Varland was a ceiling pick when they took him. So was Wei Chung Wang. They also drafted Caleb Smith, although they traded that right away, I believe, to the Cubs. Caleb Smith had like a couple solid seasons with the Marlins later on. So that was an interesting one. But yeah, they don't make too many of these, so it was a little surprising that they took somebody, especially somebody who doesn't have that much of a ceiling. But I think, like you said, they're hoping they can find kind of that innings eater in either a swingman role, somebody who can eat 3 innings if you're losing by 5 runs, somebody who can just kind of get outs. He gets a ton of ground balls. Like you said, it's the sinker plays well at the bottom and gets a ton of grounders. And then the other thing, I may have missed you saying this, but he also just didn't walk many people last year, which is a nice thing to have for somebody who that was actually one of Varland's issues. And it's often a Rule 5 picks issue, is that he just can't throw enough strikes to even keep himself on the mound. So I don't know that I'm crazy confident in him making the roster, but I think in that Bryce Wilson role, if he has a solid spring, I think they'll give him a chance coming out of spring, because they have a lot of guys who are optionable in their bullpen actually right now. And honestly, on the edge of their rotation too, with guys like DL Hall. So I think they are going to give him a fair shot. And I wouldn't be totally shocked if he ends up finding his way onto the roster. I don't know if he's a guy I can really see making it a whole season, just with how the Brewers kind of swap guys in and out of the bullpen so often, and how much they like to have optionality for their pitching staff. But there's also some injury maneuvering you can do and everything else that comes into play once you get into the season. So he's interesting. He's more interesting than I thought when I initially saw the pick, because I was expecting him to, when I first would look at him, I was like, oh, this is definitely going to be a guy throwing like mid-90s with lack of command. And it was the complete opposite of what I was expecting when I started looking into him. But I think there's a higher floor than you normally get for these types of picks. And that does make him interesting. That makes it kind of feasible that he could make it to the roster and potentially perform well enough to stay on the roster. And the fact there's looking at him as a starter in spring, I think, like you said, that's what they did with Bryce Wilson last year. And I'm guessing they don't really want him to start this year, but it also might be a case where they're like, well, if he can get through this season pitching well in that swingman role, he might be a back of the rotation candidate in the future too. So interesting pick. Again, probably not the guy I would have picked if I were in that spot, but it also, I get the logic behind it, and I could see it working out.
If he does end up in the rotation, then I think there's potential for him to not necessarily be the next Bryce Wilson, but then in that role, maybe like the next Colin Ray type, just a guy who's kind of just chugging along. He's not great, but he's going to give you competitive innings. He's going to keep you in the game almost every time he's out there and just soak up some volume. I do think now that you see a move like this, I do think that does add a little bit more context as well to the decision to let Colin Ray go.
Mm-hmm.
Because like you're kind of wondering like where are you going to get innings for a whole lot cheaper than the price that you could have paid to keep Colin Ray or even Bryce Wilson. And I didn't really want Bryce Wilson to stick around on the pitching staff, but I think someone could still make that argument of like, I mean, it's at the end of the day, it's still not terrible innings, and he's, giving you some more flexibility in some other areas because he's able to eat innings in multiple roles. But I mean, if you're gonna go cheaper and even more cost efficient somehow, I mean, this is it. Like Rule 5 guy, minor league guy, scoop him up and just see what happens. So as a Rule 5 pick, he is not allowed to be optioned to the minor leagues. That's what Spencer was talking about with the roster flexibility thing. But at the same time, I mean, if he fills that Bryce Wilson role, there was never really a point in time, even when Bryce Wilson was working as a long man in the bullpen, where you were like, man, it'd be nice if we could option Bryce Wilson right now. Because again, he was just he was flexible. He stayed healthy. All of those things. Like, there's never really a need to send that guy down. And if that guy's eating, like 3 innings in a game out of the pen, that saves you a couple of other guys in that bullpen as well. And I think you need to remember that too when you're talking about optionability and all this kind of stuff. So I do think they are kind of hoping, though, that he can fill either that Bryce Wilson role, or maybe, if we're really getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, the Colin Ray type role, or something in the middle maybe. But this does seem to be their idea of how they're going to replace some of those innings. And if it doesn't work, I mean, no big deal. Again, he's not a high ceiling guy. So if it doesn't work, you give him back, and you probably don't feel like you really lost out on anything. I think with Gus Varland, it is a little bit different because, like, the ceiling is still there. And I'm guessing the Brewers would have liked to still have the opportunity to try to realize that ceiling, but they just couldn't do it because he just was not big league ready. So they ended up having to offer him back to the Dodgers. But an interesting move here. If I had to guess, I think he will be on the opening day roster just for those innings early on. And if it doesn't work out, big deal. You're cutting your losses and you're not really losing a whole lot of anything because, again, there's not a huge ceiling here. But kind of an interesting way to see the Brewers go about trying to fill some of those bulk, low leverage innings. That was not the only lefty the Brewers acquired that day and added to their 40-man roster. They also signed left-handed reliever Grant Wolfram to a minor league or a MLB deal, And that's significant because this is basically how you get a guy like Grant Wolfram. So he has never appeared in the big leagues. He's never been on a 40-man roster before. That's how he was able to elect free agency, because the Rangers did not add him to their 40-man roster. He spent the 2024 season pitching for their AAA affiliate, and while he was down there, he pitched to a 3.34 ERA, a 3.63 FIP, a nice 25.6% strikeout rate. Walk rate is still a little bit high, but he's a guy who is probably going to ride that bullpen shuttle now in 2024. So this is essentially the pitching equivalent of the Blake Perkins deal that we saw a few years ago. The Brewers signed him to a minor league deal with Blake Perkins was never especially likely to actually make the opening day roster. This is effectively the equivalent of like selecting someone to the 40-man roster. This is the first time he's been on a 40-man roster, so he has a fresh set of options. There's no language in that contract, to our knowledge, that stipulates that he needs to be on the MLB roster. He's a rookie now, and he comes with all of those same rules relating to options, club control, all of that stuff that would apply to any other rookie. So you don't necessarily need to think of this as a full-time MLB signing. This is basically the Brewers signing a guy who evidently has some qualities that they like, who can now ride that bullpen shuttle. He's a tall guy too, by the way. He's another one of these lefties who's like 6'8". But when you look at the arsenal, Spencer, you can kind of break this down a little bit too if you want, because I know you have some thoughts on it. We talked about how Connor Thomas is generally a slider-heavy guy. As a short-range reliever, Grant Wolfram is even more slider-heavy.
Mm-hmm.
And it's mostly going to be slider four-seamer, but he also has a two-seam fastball. StatCast labels like two-seamers and sinkers, both as sinkers, but he's one of those guys where, especially if you look at the plot we have up on the video right now,
yeah,
this is a two-seamer. Like, I refuse to call any pitch that has like more than 10 inches of induced vert a sinker, because that ball's not really sinking, it's just running. So that's a two-seamer. Two-seamer runs, a sinker sinks, as the name implies. I know some people don't care, but that's how I see it. And I'm going to be stubborn and stick to that, because pitch classification matters a lot to me. I think we need to do this the right way if we're going to just have informed discussions about pitching. But he also has a curveball as well. So I mentioned the slider is the main breaking ball. Doesn't use the curve a ton, but Spencer, I'm under the impression that you actually like the curveball quite a bit.
I mean, I like the curveball. I don't know if I would go out on the quite a bit from there, but I do think. Did I say that in my tweet? Are you using my?
Well, I think you said that you like the curveball more than the slider, is what you said.
Oh, I think I did say potentially more at first glance.
Potentially more.
but I do like the curve. I think it's a legit 2 breaking ball mix. Like they're very different shapes. As you can see, if you are watching the video on the pitch plot, there's a pretty big gap between the slider and the curveball in terms of like the drop that he gets on the pitch. It's a high spin pitch. Again, Jack mentioned it's a 6'8" guy. So this is coming from a big release. There's a lot of movement on both of the pitches. But they're different. And it had a 35% whiff rate against it. It wasn't used a ton in AAA, like Jack mentioned, but I just like the fact that he does have both of them, and that I think both of them are pretty usable. Using the slider, I would imagine, and the numbers kind of bear it out, that it's a pitch he's much more comfortable landing in the zone. He threw it at his in zone rate with the slider was in around 53%, but with the curve, it was around 42, which is fine because that seemed to be a pitch he wanted to kind of use as an out pitch a little bit. I just like that he has both of them. I like that he has 2 fastballs. Like you said, it's not a sinker. It's not. It's the 4-seam, but it gets more run. Like that's really what it is. But I like the combination, and I also enjoyed he did like an interview with a local newspaper from wherever he's from, talking about how he noticed how the Brewers have had success with big-bodied lefties like Jared Koenig and Brian Hudson over the last couple of years, and like it just felt like a good fit for people who have figured out how to help those guys move well and put them in good positions. And I thought that was interesting. I think it is definitely true. I mean, those are 2 very good examples of guys that were kind of cast off in the baseball world. Obviously, Hudson had been DFA'd. I think he had more interest around the league than a guy like Koenig did, but Koenig was signing on a minor league deal. And this is somebody who Wolfram mentioned. He had, I think, 16 teams who were after him. So that's why the Brewers kind of had to go to this major league deal to get it done. But to me, when I look at it, I think it's a profile that could help out of the bullpen. I think, like he mentioned, it's the type of like physical profile that they've been able to work well with in terms of big, tall lefties. I think the one thing that stands out to me is that it's not like a Brian Hudson in terms of extension. He's not a huge extension guy, especially for his height. He's probably pretty limited in his extension for his height. But either way, I just think you mentioned Blake Perkins, and it does remind me of that. Perkins went to AAA to start the year. He spent probably about half the year there before he got his call to the big leagues his first season with the Brewers. And that's what they can do here. He has all 3 options. He can go to AAA, and he's on the 40-man. That's really the only difference between signing him on a minor league deal and a major league deal here. There's no requirement for him to be on the major league deal or major league side. And I know that's not in the contract because he mentioned it in the article. He just wants to try and make sure they don't have the choice, or to take the choice out of their hands by performing so well in spring, is basically how he worded it. But the Brewers can option him. But yeah, this is a guy that I think kind of moves to the front of that bullpen depth. Not quite, I think the Brewers probably have 15 guys right now that are on the 40-man that you probably feel pretty comfortable with, and that makes it more difficult for him to make the roster right away. But I think he's a guy that has the type of stuff, has, from the sound of it, a pretty good mindset coming into things about just wanting to get better and feeling like he's in a good organization to do that with. And just kind of history tells us this is a profile that the Brewers can do well with. So I'm looking forward to seeing how he does. Again, I believe it's going to be in Nashville to start the year, but he'll be one I'm keeping an eye on. I'll be watching some of his outings, I'm sure, but also just seeing how the stuff looks, seeing if they've made any adjustments to the profile. And Jack, when you're in spring, I'm sure you're going to talk to him about it because that's your thing. You're going to find something to talk about with him. But like, it'll be interesting to watch. It's a name I'd never heard before, and I know way more minor leaguers than I should, but I will say I don't normally know minor league relief pitchers from other organizations. So it was a name that wasn't really top of mind for me. But as soon as I looked into him, I thought he was pretty interesting. Like a guy that I could easily see helping the Brewers at some point in the next, even if it's not next year, but in the next couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing that jumps out to me here really stuff-wise. And, like we talked about, he is tall, but he's not like crazy funky or anything.
Yeah.
But I would have said a lot of the same things about Jared Koenig. as well going into this year. Like I was aware of who Jared Koenig was because I keep tabs on these kinds of signings, but there was nothing like, okay, he's got an okay sinker, an okay cutter, curveball maybe could be something, but like there's nothing in that profile that really screams this guy's going to be their next breakout reliever. And that's kind of how I feel about this one too. But again, it's at the very least, he's giving you some flexibility because he is one of those optionable relievers. So he joins guys like Elvis Peguero or JB Bukauskas as guys the Brewers can kind of shuttle up and down. We've talked before about how they did need more guys like that, and now they brought one in Wolfram. And maybe everything clicks for him. Maybe, like you talked about, the Brewers kind of figure out the most optimal way for him to use his body. They're very good with the biomechanical stuff. Like when people talk about the pitching lab, a lot of people like to talk about like pitch design and all this stuff. Like that's all well and good, but like if we're really being honest with ourselves, just about every team in baseball has that now. I think where the Brewers still separate themselves a little bit is how good they are at the biomechanical stuff.
Yes.
And that's kind of why Wolfram is bringing some of that up as well. So I think that's something to watch. But again, maybe things click for him, maybe they don't. At the very least, it gives the Brewers some flexibility, a guy who you can kind of bomb up and down from AAA in the big leagues. I do think there's an argument to be made that he should go more with the two-seamer than the four-seamer. I'm looking at the numbers on the four-seamer right now. I think this pitch is just not great. I think it kind of sucks actually because it's not. So he averages like 3 inches of horizontal break arm side. And sometimes when you see that average number, it can be because if you're looking at this chart on video, basically the four seam blob for some guys, that'll mean it's like basically residing right on the zero line, which means sometimes it cuts quite a bit. For him, that average of 3 basically just means that not really that it's cutting. He'll throw a couple once in a while that seem to have some cut, but a lot of these are just really, really straight. And there's not a lot of vert on them. And his vertical approach angle, I'm looking on this graphic, is not good either. Like, I think there's just a much better argument to be made for that sinker, or not sinker, two-seamer. Playing a little bit better. It's not a great pitch either. I do wonder if there are some concerns that it's kind of a dead zone pitch, but, you know, if the Brewers can maybe add another inch of run to that or something, or maybe do something to even kill some of the carry on it and get a little bit more sink, I feel like he's got a better starting point with that pitch than he does in the four-seamer. So I'm a little curious to see if the Brewers kind of tweak that a little bit. I'd be willing to guess that at the very least he's going to throw that two-seamer more than we've seen him throw it so far. So there's some stuff to work with here. Again, none of these pitches really scream great pitch to me. And if you look at, you know, the stuff ratings, none of them are great either. But you never know what the Brewers are able to work with. And again, there's who's to say that this is actually the version of Grant Wolfram that we're going to have when the Brewers are all said and done with him. So we'll see what happens. But again, just a guy to keep an eye on, especially when we get to camp. You're right, Spencer. I will absolutely talk to him if I get a chance to, because I like to talk pitching with anyone who will give me some interesting insight, because I'm weird and this is the kind of stuff that gets me fired up. We have one more minor signing to talk about, and it's another lefty. This is Bruce Zimmermann. The Brewers actually agreed to a minor league deal with him earlier on Thursday. So a few hours before we started recording this, Bruce Zimmermann last pitched with the Baltimore Orioles in 2023 in the big leagues. The numbers have not been good for him in the big leagues. He's got an ERA of over 5.5 in his big league career. And even in AAA in 2024, 4.34 ERA, nothing to write home about there. Pretty similar peripherals. The thing that jumps out to me after looking at Bruce Zimmermann after this signing was first reported is very, very off-speed heavy. And if you're watching video here, you can see the graphic where we have the pitch mix up. A lot of changeups in AAA, a lot of sliders in AAA, some curveballs as well. But I ran through the numbers. Only 36% of the pitches he threw in the minor leagues were fastballs this year. So he's got both a sinker and a four-seamer, and he used them roughly equally. It kind of depends on, you know, what handedness he's facing. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter which fastball he throws because they both suck. They are terrible. opponents have absolutely destroyed his fastballs in the big leagues. I think like every year, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I looked at it on Savant. In the big leagues, it's like you're talking like, 450 weighted on base average every year against both kinds of fastballs, or at least close to it almost every year. It's kind of a disjointed sample because he's never pitched like a full big league season. And then you look at some of these movement numbers, and yeah, it starts to make a little bit of sense. Not great qualities velocity wise. He doesn't throw hard. Not great qualities movement wise. Again, another guy who throws a pitch that I don't know if I would necessarily call a sinker, but it also doesn't really run a whole lot either. It's not a great pitch. So I'm very curious to see what's going to happen with the fastballs here, because I do think the breaking stuff is okay. It's not great, but it's okay. He likes to go mainly slider for the breaking ball to lefties. He's the left-handed pitcher. And then curveball is the breaking ball for righties. Nothing out of the ordinary there. But really, I think if he's going to be remotely effective, and again, I don't know if this is a guy who's ever going to sniff the big leagues with the Brewers this year, but he is depth. I think a few things have to go wrong for Bruce Zimmermann to ever pitch for the Milwaukee Brewers in 2025. But if he is going to have any success at the big league level, or even more success as a professional in general, something's got to happen with the fastballs. He needs to find a way to make either one of them a usable pitch, not even a good pitch, but a pitch that's just good enough that it can at least play with the others, and he doesn't have to constantly worry about those fastballs getting shelled. I mean, I'm even looking at like his minor league numbers right now. It says on this graphic, his expected weighted on base average in AAA against the sinker was 404 and 360 against the four seamers. So even minor league opponents were crushing these fastballs. I did find a video of him from earlier this offseason training at Tread Athletics, which, if you don't know what that is, think like Driveline. It's kind of a similar deal. Not as crazy with like biometric stuff and like physical training stuff seemingly as Driveline is, but it's still very oriented on data-driven, science-driven pitch design. And in this video, this is from like late November, right around Thanksgiving, I think, is when they put the video up. He's with Tread Athletic. He's at Tread Athletics with Cole Irvin, who used to be one of his teammates in Baltimore, another lefty. And they're working specifically in this video on his, I'm going to call this one a two-seamer again, because it's like 10 inches of vertical break, induced verts. So kind of right on that line for me of what I'd call a sinker versus a two-seamer. But he's working on this pitch, and the first few that he throws, again, kind of similar to what you see in these average numbers here. But then they started having him throw like the seam shifted sinker, which basically what you're doing is you're actually getting the ball to run and sink by cutting it, because there's a lot of crazy science stuff here, and I'm not a scientist, but basically the amount of the white spot on the ball that you're exposing to the air on one side, and then the amount of air that's getting exposed to seams on the other side, it creates like this imbalance on the ball to the point that it actually like pushes the ball the opposite way of what you'd expect. So by cutting the ball, if you have it oriented right in your hand, you can actually get the ball to run more. This is how Kyle Hendricks used to throw, or still does throw his sinker. He's still an active pitcher. I shouldn't discredit him by assuming that he's out of the league. He signed with the Angels.
He did.
But when he did this different sinker grip where he was cutting the ball more, he got up to like 21 inches of horizontal movement on it. So I'm wondering, just off the top of my head, if there's, from what we have available from our perspective, is if this is the kind of thing that the Brewers might be seeing. Like, you remember when the Brewers signed Colin Ray? The Brewers, one of the things that they saw was he went to Driveline and he developed a sweeper. And he kind of made all of his stuff like just a little bit better. Maybe that's what's going on here again, where you have a guy who is putting in the work over the offseason, and he's, again, making these pitches better. And this is kind of what I mean when I talked about what I said a few minutes ago with like the whole pitch design revolution. That's not really specific to the Brewers. There are all kinds of resources all over the place where you can do this stuff, and it's kind of become common knowledge now. Just how a lot of this works. It's widespread. It's not really a Brewers thing anymore. But these are the kind of things that at least pique your interest a little bit. Okay, maybe he did figure out something with that sinker. And now if that sinker is a usable pitch, we'll throw him in Nashville and see if there's some growth there. And then, if it gets that far, maybe he can help us. And that's kind of what minor league signings are all about. Like
Yep.
the Brewers are not just going to sign guys to fill spots. Yes, that's going to be part of it. Like you do need to fill out your minor league rosters and you do need guys to eat innings down there for like your AAA team. But you're still going to look for guys who could potentially be diamonds in the rough, and those are the guys you're going to try to sign to those contracts. Like you can at least see something that makes you think, maybe something could click here. And again, I'd be willing to bet Bruce Zimmermann is most likely a guy who's going to be eating innings for the Nashville Sounds. But if you're looking for something that maybe the Brewers have seen, maybe it piques some interest, it is something like that. Like, okay, he's working on his sinker. He's adding more run to it. Maybe now that's going to be a useful pitch for him. And it does kind of change the calculus for him a little bit of how effective the other pitches are going to be, how everything all kind of comes together. So again, nothing crazy to dive into here, but that is just one takeaway to have from this right now. Like this is something he's working on, and this is probably something the Brewers took notice of.
Yeah, I agree. I've got nothing to add on Zimmermann. I would just kind of echo the point you made about these types of signings are, it's always very funny to me when I mostly see it from the Brewers perspective, but I also see it with fans from all around MLB when a team announces a signing like this and everybody's just in the reply is like, "Oh, this is going to help a lot. This is going to be great. Oh, I'm so glad we're signing people like this. A guy who had a 5 ERA last time he was in MLB." And it's like, you would have said the same thing about a Jared Koenig last offseason. Like these types of signings, you're signing him because, yes, you do need to fill roster spots in the upper levels, and that does play a role, like Jack said. And at the same time, it's because you think if things click, if things go right, or on the other end, if things go wrong for a lot of people, and you just need somebody in the big leagues, like this is a guy who has big league experience. This is a guy who's been up there, who can at least handle, giving us 2 starts if we have an insane amount of injuries or something going on. But at the same time, on the high end, you might have found a little bit of a, like Jack talked about, maybe he's figured out the 2-seam, and all of a sudden now he has a fastball that can play, and he has 3 off-speed pitches that have all played pretty decently, even without a fastball that's helping. Like usually you need a decent fastball for the off-speed to play well, because eventually they just start sitting soft, and they're just not worried about the fastball. So the fact that they've played okay without a fastball, that could at least keep them honest. Now if a fastball can keep them honest, maybe the rest of the stuff plays up even a little bit more, and all of a sudden you've got a guy who can help you in the big leagues, and that's the high end outcome for a guy like Zimmermann. But all the other stuff helps the organization throughout the rest of the season, even if he doesn't come through and end up mattering in a big way at the big league level. Like these signings do matter, and at the very least, they're not hurting anything. So I always find it very interesting how people will react so negatively to it, because you're not getting hurt by this unless you're a big Nashville Sounds fan that goes to all their games. Like, and Bruce Zimmermann's not able to get outs at the AAA level, then I guess maybe you're gonna have some hurt, but like it's not going to affect you negatively. All it can really do is it's a shot. It's a lotto ticket in a way, but it also just kind of fills spots, helps the team get what it needs out of its AAA team. And in worst case scenario, no matter what, like I said, this is a guy with some experience that wouldn't come up and have it be too big for him. The moment wouldn't be too big, because you at least know he can go out there and step on a major league mound and throw pitches over the plate. Like that's the worst case scenario. So, yeah, I just always find that funny. I like to, kind of along the lines of Wolfram, I like going back to the Blake Perkins tweet when they announced his signing. It was like 2 days after Hunter Renfroe got traded, and everybody in the comments is like, "This is our Renfroe replacement. This is what the Brewers are doing." The Cubs signed, who did they sign at the time? I can't even remember. It was a pretty big name. It might have been Suzuki that offseason or something, Stroman even maybe, but this is our reply. This is our, response to that. And it's like, guys, it was a bit of a lotto ticket. And now look, you've got a really solid defensive outfielder who switch hits and can play every outfield spot and can come up with some big hits, steal some bases. Like, these types of signings matter, but they also don't hurt you. Like, they almost never hurt you in any way. So it's basically a low risk, almost no risk type of signing with some upside, and that's a good thing. And it's something the Brewers have done really well with over the last, really, since Stearns came in. This has been a means for them to add legitimate, helpful roster spots. Like, they've gotten quite a few solid players out of minor league free agency, or in a Blake Perkins type of case, a major league signing from somebody who was a minor league free agent. So um, I guess my encouragement would be to not immediately react super negatively to minor league deals, because there's just really no reason to. But yeah, that's all I got.
It's now time for some more listener questions. We took a couple earlier in the show. These are just on any miscellaneous topics that we weren't already planning ahead on covering. We'll start with a question from Henry, who actually sent this to us a couple weeks ago for our last full episode. And I feel really bad because he talked about how he was excited for the show that week, and then I completely forgot to answer his question when we were recording. So, Henry, I'm sorry. I promise I didn't ignore you. I was just trying to peruse the agenda, and I completely skipped over it. But we will get to it this week. Henry asked us about Ha-Seong Kim as a potential free agent target. He said, I can't come up with any good reason why we shouldn't be all over Ha-Seong Kim, besides maybe lack of power. Talk me out of it a little bit so I don't get my hopes up too high. Well, first of all, I give you credit for not wanting to get your hopes up too high, because I understand that while baseball fandom is sometimes about being crazy and getting your hopes unreasonably high, sometimes I think people could benefit from maybe being a little bit more realistic, because it could save you some disappointment down the line. But Spencer, do you want to talk a little bit about Ha-Seong Kim? I know you have a little bit of a comp for him in terms of
Yeah.
guys you've
So
come
I
away
guess
from
my
overseas.
first thing on him is that I do think he's probably a second baseman only on the infield, which we've talked about before. I think our preference would be for a left side of the infield, somebody on the left side to be added, because we would like Ortiz at shortstop over Bryce Terang. And I think if we added Ha-Seong Kim, you are looking at Terang moving to short. And that's not a complete, like, okay, I'm not signing Ha-Seong Kim because of that, but I do think it's a bit of a negative for me. I think the other part is that the power that you touched on is a big part of this. So for me, I look at Jung-Hoo Lee, who the Giants signed last offseason to a really big deal um, as an outfielder. And when I don't have as much information as I would really need on Ha-Seong Kim. It's not totally out there. I don't have, obviously, a ton of batted ball data to look at and everything else. But based on what I've seen, I don't think it's a matter of like power coming down the line. I think this is a guy who's pretty well a contact hitter. We talked about it with a guy like Caleb Durbin when we discussed the Devin Williams trade. I don't know how many more profiles you like that you can add to this team and still have a lineup that can really produce. And I know I actually saw there was some debate. It might have been under, no, I think it was just on Brewer Fanatic, but there were a lot of people who were saying, like, well, if you score runs, it doesn't matter if you hit home runs. Like, you could just do it with on base and stealing bases and everything else. But technically you are correct if you are scoring the runs, but it takes a lot more quality sequencing, which is mostly luck. You need to you have to have a lot of hits. If you do that, home runs can make up for a lack of hits. You need power in your lineup. And I get it. I don't think anyone there, to be fair to everyone who was saying this, I don't think anyone there was saying, like, you can build the entire lineup out of contact hitters and you would be fine. Like, they all acknowledged to a degree you need power. But I think there was a thought that, like, well, 3 or 4 guys like that, you could probably get by. I have a harder time seeing that. I think you need a good amount of power, at least the threat of power in your lineup. And that's why a guy like this would concern me a little bit. I think you are adding another person who doesn't have that in his profile. But at the same time, as an overall player, like, he is a good hitter. Like, he does have a very good approach at the plate. He has good bat to ball skills. I think he probably has more like extra base hit power than like a Terang. I think he hits more line drives from what I've seen and heard. Again, I don't have all the numbers in front of me. I just don't have access to that. But from what I've seen and heard, it sounds like he can be a legit gap to gap guy, and he does do it quite a bit, or he has done it quite a bit in his time overseas. But I just don't know it's a great fit for the Brewers. I would imagine he's probably going to be a solid big league player from what I can tell, especially as a second baseman, as somebody who can just get on base, obviously singles, doubles, those types of things. I just, for me, the fit with the Brewers in particular isn't great for a number of reasons, but if he could play the left side of the infield, I might consider it a little bit more, but I think that on top of everything else makes it really hard for me to be super interested. But I think he's a good player. I think from the Brewers perspective, it might not make a ton of sense.
I looked at some numbers too as you were talking for the last couple minutes. He's only exceeded double-digit home runs or even reached double-digit home runs in the KBO once, and he did it in this last year in 2024 when he hit 11. Doubles totals are not really anything to write home about either. His career high is 29. For a minute, I was like, this could be a Brewers-like profile just because, like decent on base. Good defense. He did win the Gold Glove at second base, so he is regarded
he's
as
a good defender,
pretty good defender at second base. So I think that counts or something. But I did look at the walk rate. It's only like 8%. I wish we had like chase rates instead because that's a little bit more likely to actually translate to what you could expect him to do in terms of plate discipline. But 8% walk rate is pretty pedestrian. So it's tough to say, but based on that, maybe he's not a great swing decision guy, like what the Brewers tend to emphasize. I do get the question because remember Henry asked this before they picked up Durbin.
Yes.
So that's a big part of this as well. If we had actually answered this question when we were supposed to, I don't know if my answer would be a whole lot different. I think I would say the same thing about, they need some power. I don't think a guy like this really does anything for them over what they could already plug in over there. I think that's even more true now that you have Caleb Durbin. So I personally think that there are probably better places to look. I mean, Kim is left-handed, so maybe he kind of fits in that sense because Durbin is a right-handed bat, but you also do still have the lefty and Terang in your infield. But I think overall, probably just an example of a guy who I would guess is going to come to the big leagues and not really be an impact player. Like he'll be solid. You can roll him out there most days at second base. But I have a hard time seeing him, especially right off the bat, exceeding like, I don't know, 2.5 wins above replacement, like nothing crazy. So I think it's a fair option to consider given how limited that market is for the Brewers. But at the same time, it's one of those potential acquisitions that I don't think really does anything for me, kind of along the lines of what you talked about. Yeah. We'll go back to Brian for another question here. So he asked about the Devin Williams trade, but he also asked about Tyler Black, as long as we're on the topic of left-handed infielders and are they going to be role players in the big leagues. He asked, does Tyler Black make the team as a backup first baseman to Rhys Hoskins or in a bench role? How do their platoon splits compare? So talking about Tyler Black and Rhys Hoskins, or is he better as a trade chip? Seems like it's see what Black can do or cut bait. So I really just feel like a lot of this comes down to, can Tyler Black play a solid first base? Because I think if he can, suddenly it becomes quite a bit easier to fit him onto this roster because that is essentially the role the Brewers had for Jake Bauers last year. Not crazy versatile position-wise, but he was a competent defender at first base. He had good hands over there. And there were a lot of times where even if Bauers' bat basically collapsed down the stretch, it was still good to have him on the roster at times, especially to come in to play defense late in games or if you had some games where you could DH him and put him at first base and DH Rhys Hoskins, excuse me. I think that was beneficial for them at times. The problem with Tyler Black is he's also a bad first baseman. And generally speaking, I think it's become increasingly clear that he's just not an infielder, and he's probably never going to be an infielder
Yeah.
because I understand that he's not crazy deep into his pro career, but eventually you reach a point where, I mean, you've tried every position on the dirt except shortstop. You haven't taken to a single one of them, even first base. Like at some point, if you don't have the hands or the instincts to play on the infield, you just don't. And that's
Yeah.
when you're talking about like, a guy's hands or his instincts, the instincts in particular on the infield, like there's only so much of that that you can acquire. Like it's one of those things where either you have it or you don't. You can try to coach it up a little bit and maybe you can make a guy go from really bad to playable, but even in Tyler Black's case, he hasn't really gotten that far yet. And the fact that he couldn't handle first base very well last year either and looked very awkward over there all the time. The footwork wasn't good. The hands weren't good over there. I don't know if it's the greatest idea to go into the year with two first basemen who really should never be on the field because Rhys
Yeah.
Hoskins, as a reminder, is still in my mind one of the worst defensive first basemen I've ever seen play in person. At least he was in 2024. I understand he was coming off the knee injury, but he was never a good defender before that either. So to have that guy as your starting first baseman and then have him either splitting time with Tyler Black or backed up by Tyler Black or, having Tyler Black fill in for him against a tough lefty. Another guy who probably should be a full-time DH. I don't know if that's the best way to go. It does raise the question, though, of who exactly is going to back up Rhys Hoskins at first base, because right now the other leading candidate is Andre Monasterio. So they really don't have a true backup first baseman. But at the same time, if Rhys Hoskins stays healthy, I'm not sure that's a huge concern because you don't always like to waste a roster spot on a guy who's first base only. It worked out okay with Jake Bauers last year, but I think ideally you'd have a guy who can play multiple spots. Be nice if they could land like a third base and first base type
Yep.
who could handle both positions. But to me, it does not make sense for Tyler Black to be that guy if he cannot play defense at first base. And that's really what it comes down to. As far as being a trade chip, I think that's the best way to go. I actually just wrote about this earlier in the week at Brewer Fanatic, kind of touching on what we talked about in the past episode. Yes, Tyler Black has options left, so you can send him down. So technically, there's nothing forcing you to trade him. But if he's on the 40-man roster and in AAA like he was for most of 2024, he's so limited that even if somebody gets hurt, he's probably not going to be the first choice to replace that guy because he's so limited. He can't play the field unless you can get him in the outfield where I think he could be passable. But there's a lot of things that need to happen for that to really open up for him. So I'm not really considering that as a serious opportunity for him unless the Brewers trade from their outfield depth. But I think it just makes more sense to flip Black instead of one of the guys you already have in that outfield. But if he's on the 40-man roster as quote unquote depth, but he's never actually a realistic choice to be promoted from AAA, he's not actually giving you any depth. He's really just wasting a roster spot. And that sounds a little harsh. It's not a complete waste of a roster spot because, if Rhys Hoskins gets hurt, yeah, Tyler Black probably is the guy to plug in there and just see what happens. But outside of that, man, it's really hard to see a scenario where he actually gets a promotion where he's going to get a decent amount of playing time and a chance to contribute. Again, if he can suddenly handle first base and he becomes even like in a crazy world, a good defensive first baseman, I think that changes it quite a bit for him because now there's a spot for him as a guy who is not only a left-handed bat, but someone who actually helps you in the field at least a little bit at first base. But I have a hard time seeing that happen. If he couldn't pick up first base, while playing almost a full season over there, not really optimistic that he's ever going to pick it up, especially because while I understand there's a learning curve, First base is generally pretty easy to figure out compared to a lot of other positions. Basically, once you get reps with the footwork and cutoffs and that kind of positioning, it should start to come pretty quickly to you. And it
Yes.
did not to Tyler Black. So I think right now I would not count on him being Rhys Hoskins' platoon partner, and I would count on him being a trade chip. Spencer, I think you feel pretty similarly.
Yeah, I agree. Contrary to what Ron Washington says in Moneyball, first base is not that hard to learn. It just isn't. Um, it's something he should have been able to. If he was going to be able to pick up on it, I think we would have seen maybe not, perfect defense, great defense over at first, but it would not have looked nearly as clunky as it did. And I watched a decent amount of him in Nashville at first, too. And this is a guy who was straight whiffing on throws. It was rough. It was really, really bad. Like going back to early in his Brewers career, I raised some pretty big questions about the defense. I got some pushback on it because everyone was like, well, he's a pretty good athlete. Like he'll figure it out. And I saw him play center field in person for the Timber Rattlers in 2022. And I immediately said, I'm like, he's an outfielder. Like, do not put him back on the dirt. Like, this is an outfielder. It has not worked in the infield at all. I just don't have any confidence that it's going to be even passable at any spot on the infield. I agree with you. I honestly think he could be more than passable in the outfield. I think he could be a pretty decent outfielder defensively. He is a good athlete. He went out to center field for Nashville last year and made some pretty ridiculous catches without having even played outfield for 2 years, basically. I think he's naturally an outfielder, but with the Brewers, that makes him 6th in the pecking order, basically, going into next season in the outfield depth, if that. And the fact that he has no more versatility, he's a lefty bat who the Brewers have a lot of in the outfield specifically. It's just very hard for me to find a spot for him. So, yeah, unless he did make some magical improvement at first base this offseason, because then I do think there's absolutely a spot for him. Like you said, that's the spot for him. There's nobody in that role right now, but it was so bad that I agree with you that I think Rhys is one of the worst first basemen I've ever seen. And I said numerous times that Tyler Black is a worse first baseman than Rhys Hoskins. So that's where I'm at with him right now. And that makes it really hard for me to feel confident with those two being the options at first base heading into next season. So I agree. I think it's trade time for Black. And it's not ideal because I do think he's going to hit at the big league level when he gets an opportunity to, but I just don't see how it's going to happen with the Brewers. It's just gotten to the point where it's really hard to see it working out here. And I saw some people saying, well, why would we? I think it was under your article, actually, Jack, like, well, this would be kind of selling low on him. And I think by next year, that's probably when it ends up being selling low, because that's when everyone recognizes, okay, they don't have any spot for him. He clearly doesn't have a defensive home that they can play him at. Why are we paying anything more than just, a lotto ticket to get him, because they aren't ever going to be able to use him. So I think right now the Brewers can at least feign that they have high hopes for Black still helping this team. And that might give them at least a chance to get a little bit more in return. But I don't think this is selling low, maybe selling low relative to where it was a year ago, but I don't think it's selling at its lowest point. I think there's a pretty good chance that would be happening either at the deadline or next season, kind of in the Joey Weimer fashion of what ended up happening with him.
Yeah, I think my response to anyone who's saying you'd be selling low on him right now is the value is far more likely to go down than it is to go up, for all the reasons we've talked about. The limitations with the profile, the lack of fit here, just the more time he spends in AAA just kind of stalling there, because he doesn't really have a whole lot left to prove down there. The more time that he just kind of wastes sitting down there, teams are going to see that. They're going to realize there's very clearly not a spot for him, especially if the defense doesn't get better. Just the larger that sample gets without the defense getting better, teams are going to notice that as well. So I think there's just way more room for that trade value to go down than it is for it to go up. So yes, I think they could have gotten more for him if they traded him a year ago. I can understand why they didn't at that time, because you still don't really know how the roster is going to shape out. But with where we're at right now and where he's at right now, I think this is just it's the move you have to make, and you don't have to try to force a trade because if there really are no good packages for him, don't do it.
Yeah.
I have a hard time believing that's the case, though. I think you could still find a taker for him and get fair value, but it's not a great situation that the Brewers are in. I think this is the best way for them to handle it moving forward, though, for all parties too, because Tyler
Mhm.
Black deserves an opportunity. Like you
Exactly.
said, the bat is good enough that he deserves an opportunity. He's just not going to get it here. It's not really beneficial for the Brewers to keep him here a whole lot unless, again, Rhys Hoskins gets hurt. That's really the only way he could potentially provide some value for you, unless you, again, clear out a guy or two in that outfield and maybe he joins that mix. Otherwise, he's probably not getting an opportunity here. So he's not really helping the Brewers a whole lot. He's not really giving them value for a 40-man spot. And he's also not benefiting development-wise from just staying in AAA and not getting that opportunity to face big league pitching. So it might be the best route for both parties if the Brewers are able to figure something out on that front. As far as the platoon split comparison part of Brian's question, basically the other part to remember here as well is, and this is why the defense is so important, Black taking a step forward defensively, because if Rhys Hoskins bounces back to who Rhys Hoskins normally is or something close to that, he doesn't need a platoon partner offensively.
No.
He's a guy who has a career OPS a little over 800 against right-handed pitching. He's always crushed lefties, but again, he's almost always hit righties completely fine too. He's been a solid bat in those matchups as well. So he's not a guy who you platoon. So for that reason, it basically is Tyler Black needs to become a good defensive first baseman or it's kind of a bust based on how this roster is currently constructed. Or, maybe Rhys Hoskins need to just completely fall apart in 2025, but I'd be surprised if that happens. I think there's a decent chance that he's going to bounce back. He's not a very old guy. I understand his mobility was never great to begin with, but I really do think getting another year removed from that ACL surgery and not having what could have potentially been some lingering effects of coming off that hamstring injury, I really do think we're going to see a bounce back from him at the plate.
Mhm.
So again, that makes it tricky for Tyler Black. Troy asks us what I actually thought was one of the more interesting questions we got this week. Given the current demand for starting pitching, do you throw Freddy Peralta's name out there and see if anyone is willing to overpay? So I'm not doing this right now. I mean, you don't take them off the table because nobody should be off the table. They can be almost certain to stay in place because you're never going to get the offer that it would take, but you don't take anyone off the table fully, especially if you're a team like the Brewers. But I'm not doing it right now because I think he's one of those guys who's a lot more valuable to the Brewers than the return that he could get. But I do think you have to consider trading him next year because that's
Yep.
going to be the final year of his deal, assuming the Brewers pick up that second club option on that contract extension. I can't see Freddie signing another extension because he already gave up a lot of money when he signed that first one before he was established. And now he's in a position where, while he hasn't reached the ceiling that we all would have hoped for, he has established himself as a pretty durable starting pitcher who, when the dust settles, is going to give you above average production. And to have that track record now and the opportunity to hit free agency ahead of your age 30 season, he's going to be in a pretty good spot to make some money. I
Mhm.
don't think he's going to take another extension with Milwaukee. So with that in mind, he does have to become that next guy who, going into his final season, do you trade him for controllable talent? I don't know quite yet. It depends on what the offers are going to be. What kind of season does Freddie have in 24? All this stuff. Who do the Brewers have in their rotation behind him at that point? But he very much does need to be the next entry into that group of guys who you consider moving.
Yep.
It's the same situation that the Brewers had with Hader, that they had with Burns, that they had with Devin Williams, and they just flipped. Freddie's probably going to be that next guy. So I don't think it happens now, but I really think you are going to have to consider it after the 2025 season going into his final year of control in 26.
Yeah, I agree. I actually had, after seeing like the Crochet package, which he's not on that level, but like after seeing that, I did have it cross my mind. Like, man, I wonder if they've gotten any like pretty big offers for Freddie this offseason. A guy with 2 years, if you look at the starting pitching market this year, they're getting paid. Guys are getting paid. And I think that goes back to why the Brewers wanted a guy like Cortes in the trade. I think they were looking at the market and going, okay, we're not getting anything of value at the price that we would normally want to pay for these guys. So I agree with you. In the end, I think this year you want Freddy in your rotation as part of the mix. Probably your best or second best pitcher, like we've talked about. But I do think next season, off season, they should be entertaining offers, and more along the lines of like what they've done with a Burns and a Devin in terms of really entertaining them, not like going, okay, we'll listen on them. Like I think next off season, you're probably looking at the ideal move being trading him. And if you just don't get the offers, then yeah, you hold on to him and you probably get the comp pick afterwards. But I don't quite, well, I think he's a good leader and I've heard nothing but good things. I don't put him in that Willy Adames tier in terms of like what he really means to the team on that level. And I also think that's partially because I don't think a starting pitcher can have the same effect as an everyday position player. I don't think that's possible from the type of role that they play. But I do think you have to entertain it next year in a pretty major way. And in a way, going at this current moment, I view it similarly to how I viewed it with Burns and Williams, where I would almost be a little bit more surprised if Freddy is a Brewer in 2026 than if he's not. So it'll be interesting, but I do think they're very heavily going to consider it next offseason, and not this one, but it'll be on the table next offseason, and I think it'll be strongly on the table where they might be searching for offers.
Yeah, I agree with like 99% of that. I will say, I know there can be a limit on how valuable those starting pitchers are in the clubhouse compared to position players who are out there every day. But as someone who was in the clubhouse a lot this year, I was actually surprised a little bit how important Freddy Peralta is to that culture. Not for any reason having to do with him personally, but what you talked about with the starting pitcher only being on the field every 5 to 6 days type thing. But he was a big part of Jackson Chourio turning things around because he specifically talked to him after that incident with the fly ball. I remember when Carlos Rodriguez joined the Brewers, Freddy Peralta actually like went over to him in the clubhouse and was talking to him and getting him settled in ahead of his MLB debut. So that's something that you kind of notice as well. Pat Murphy also listed him frequently as one of his clubhouse pillars, and I don't think that's something that you should discount either.
No.
Is that enough to, tip the scales to keeping him? I'm not sure, so I'm not really disagreeing with you on that, but I'm just trying to make the point of,
yeah,
he is pretty important. I think he's more important than he gets credit for in that clubhouse, and I'm saying this as someone who's probably been about as tough as anyone on him evaluating his on-field performance. But I do think he brings more value in the clubhouse than people realize. And I did get to see a little bit of that up close throughout the 2024 season, being in that home clubhouse, before almost every game. So I do think it's something to think about, and that's always going to be part of the calculus. But again, I would also lean pretty heavily towards, depending on what all the situational factors are, he's a guy you very much need to consider moving, and I would have to guess that equation, the result is probably going to be it's probably better to move him than keep him for that final year.
Yeah.
Speaking of young pitchers, Jake McKibben asked us about DL Hall. Status update on him. He said Hall talked about getting knee surgery after the season. Is there any word on his progress? Not that I know of, and if I don't know of it, Spencer, I'm guessing you wouldn't know of it. But this was kind of the consensus on how he was going to approach things in 2024 when he had those checkups on his knee, especially after he had that flare-up on his first rehab assignment. There was kind of a consensus after that of, okay, you can pitch through it for the rest of the year, but you're probably going to need some kind of procedure on it. So I think the hope really is just that one way or another, that knee is healthy. And I am curious to see if just a full rehab from that knee injury, and I've talked about this a little bit before, I'm curious to see if a full rehab from that knee injury is going to help him tap into a little bit more velocity as a starting pitcher. Because as we've talked about plenty on this podcast, that is something he's going to need. He needs to have the effective version of his fastball if he's going to be anything more than like a number 5, innings either, maybe 5 and dive type guy who has to rely really heavily on his breaking stuff. So would be nice to see him get that back since that's a pretty straightforward news update. Spencer, I'm guessing you don't really have a whole lot to add on that, so we can keep moving.
Nope.
We'll go to a question we got from Joe, who asked us about Craig Yoho. Is Craig Yoho in any consideration to be part of the rotation this season, or is he more of a bullpen arm, or is he likely to start the season in AAA and be one of the first guys up when they need someone? I'm picking the last one. For as good as Craig Yoho was in AAA last year, the reality is the Brewers still have a full 40-man roster.
Yep.
They're going to give opportunities to those guys before they add Craig Yoho to the roster. It's just a management thing. You don't want to cut guys if you don't have to, because it's always good to have that depth. We're going to see Craig Yoho at some point in 2025. I'm pretty certain of it, unless there's an unforeseen injury that occurs.
Yep.
But I don't think he's really going to be a serious candidate to crack the bullpen on opening day, regardless of what he does in spring training. And I do still think there is an argument to be made that it's not the worst thing in the world for him to go back to Nashville and work on his control a little bit more. That was something that did start to crop up once he was facing more disciplined hitters in AAA. The walk rate did go up a little bit. So not the worst thing in the world for him to get those kind of reps. As far as him being part of the rotation, I did tweet about this a couple weeks ago when the Mets signed Clay Holmes to be a starter, kind of the latest example in that trend of moving relievers to the rotation. I think Craig Yoho is absolutely someone who has the arsenal to be a candidate to do that down the stretch. I really think the only reason it didn't happen already is because he had the injury concerns in college. He was a lot older than a lot of other draft picks.
Oh, yeah.
So I think the Brewers are really just focused on how do we get into the big leagues as quickly as possible while keeping him healthy. And the best way to do that was just make him a full-time reliever. He's been great in that role so far. But I do think he is someone who, whether it's with the Brewers or with someone else, because maybe his time with the Brewers will be done when it gets to this point, whether it's he goes through all of his years of club control or they trade him before he gets to the end of the years of club control. But I do think if he proves himself as a big league reliever, my guess is there will be teams who are looking at that arsenal and say, this guy could start, especially if he's proven that he's been able to stay healthy in the big league so far and succeed as a reliever, get guys out. Because I do think it is a starter's arsenal. We talk about the really good changeup. He's also got a really good slider. He's got the fastball. Does he have like a cutter too?
He throws a cutter. The cutter's probably the worst of the four, but he does throw a cutter.
He has it. Like it's kind of that can be kind of your show me pitch a little bit, another fastball variant. I do think he is someone, especially when you have breaking pitches that are that good that can do some heavy lifting. He's a guy who has a deeper arsenal, but also because that changeup's his best pitch, kind of like a screwball type pitch, that also helps him with platoon splits a lot. That's a big deal when you're going to convert to the rotation as well. Basically, as a right-handed pitcher, can you get lefties out? And he can absolutely do that. So I do think he is a guy who in the future is going to be under consideration from some people for moving to the rotation. I just don't think it's happening anytime soon, and there's a reason it hasn't happened yet, a perfectly valid one, just health concerns and how do we get him here quicker. But right now, probably going to start the season in Nashville. I'm sure we'll see him in the big league bullpen, though, at some point.
Yep. Agreed on all of that. I think even just along the lines of the health and everything, he's barely pitched since high school. Like he's thrown less than 100 innings now total, including college and last season since high school. So I think going back to Nashville, getting to kind of figure out, like you said, some of the control stuff. I also have to wonder if some of the control stuff cropped up because of him being at a pretty high inning count versus what he had thrown in the past, like a little bit of fatigue setting in at the end of a season to a guy who had gone through 2 other levels before getting to that one. Like a lot of stuff happened for him. So you always have to wonder that. But just in general, I think, like you said, he has the ability to go to AAA and not be on the 40-man roster. So I think they'd like to preserve those opportunities to keep giving guys chances who are on the 40-man. But I agree completely. we're going to see him as long as he's healthy next year. He will be in the Brewers bullpen at some point. And I won't add much to the starting thing, but when we drafted him, I tweeted immediately that I was like, I hope they give him a chance to start. And then I know Baseball America started hyping him up in Instructs, and I still said, I was like, I really hope they give him a chance to start. But I agree with what you said. I think in the end, it's related to, we want this guy to get to the big leagues quick. He was 24 when he was drafted, and we don't have the time to really build him up before doing that. Like it's going to take too long to build him up and get him here in a timely manner. So the buildup might happen in the major league, sort of like you said. It can show that he can stay healthy for a whole season, kind of keep building the inning count up, and then eventually it might go the Jordan Hicks or the Clay Holmes route. And like you said, that could be for the Brewers, that could be for his second team somewhere down the road. But I do think it should be on the table for sure.
We'll wrap up this week's episode by talking about something that I teased in the intro. This isn't Brewers specific, but I think it's something worth talking about because we both had thoughts on this when MLB released this study earlier in the week on pitcher injuries. This has obviously been a hot topic across baseball for a few years now, when every single year you have really bright, talented pitchers essentially blowing up their elbows, some of them pretty early into the season as well. I think it definitely is an epidemic, so it's something that we need to be having conversations about. So the league basically put together their official task force, so to speak, and they talk to players, coaches, executives, athletic trainers, both professional and at the amateur levels. And basically what they came up with, none of it's groundbreaking stuff. I mean, it's all the stuff you would have expected to see. They concluded that injury risk is a lot higher because pitchers are effectively pushing the limits of what the human body and what the human arm and the human elbow can handle in terms of how much stress you're putting on it, how much workload you're putting on it at that stress level. Guys are throwing harder than ever. Guys are very focused on spinning the ball more than ever. Those are stressful activities for a pitcher on their elbow. It's not a coincidence that injuries have gone up as this stuff has really taken off in the game in recent years. They also discovered that it's not just happening at the professional level, it's also happening in college, it's happening in high school, even at the youth levels. Particularly, though, once you get into that high school age bracket, you have a lot of kids who are going to showcases now, and they're already throwing in the mid to upper 90s, some of them. That's not something we used to see, and now you have a lot of these kids who are getting hurt as well. So I have a couple different thoughts on this, and my guess is you feel pretty similarly. I know we kind of talked about it a little bit yesterday, that being Wednesday. We're recording this on a Thursday night, about how we feel about this. And the problem is, I think we can all agree again, like this study makes the correlation pretty clear that there are a lot of things about modern pitching that are detrimental to a pitcher's health, that are far riskier for the health of their arms. But there are no easy answers for fixing this. And the problem is, while this is a risky way to pitch in terms of health, this is what you need to do to get outs against the best hitters in the world. You know, I know there's all the baseball dads who like to talk about how, well, what we need to do in order to combat this is we need to tell guys take a little bit off and just focus on command. Command is a very important part of pitching. I'm not saying that doesn't matter. But the reality is, even if you have good command, if you don't throw as hard, if your pitch shapes are not as good, if you don't spin the ball as well, even if you're hitting your spots better than the guy who does throw a little bit harder, you're probably going to get hit harder. That's the way it works. The numbers back this up.
Yes.
If you throw harder, guys do not hit it. They don't hit it nearly as well as if you throw softer. We're just talking about like fastball velocities now. And I know there are some guys who are very, very good command artists and very, very good at changing speeds. You can find some of those guys who succeed. Honestly, Kyle Hendricks is probably like the last prime example of this.
Yeah.
But even he's someone who the last few years has seen his production taper off pretty severely. Like the line is so fine for these kinds of guys. And it's just not an especially sustainable way to pitch in terms of production at the big league level against the best hitters in the world. You got to be able to throw good stuff at these guys because these are good hitters. They're better than they've ever been. So the pitchers need to be better than they've ever been if they're going to get outs. Baseball teams are not stupid. Professional baseball teams know that there's an inherent risk here from throwing harder. Players know there's an inherent risk from throwing harder. There's a reason why they keep doing it. It's because this is how you get outs.
Yep.
And doing it any other way with the way the game is structured right now, I just don't think that's a viable alternative. And even the guys who are considered command artists nowadays in baseball, most of those guys are still throwing 92 plus.
Mm-hmm.
Like Colin Ray last year for the Brewers is considered like more of a command, feel it out, change speeds kind of guy. Colin Ray's sinker averages like 92 miles an hour.
Yeah.
So there really are not a lot of soft tossers. And, you know, before anyone wants to bring up Brent Suter, Brent Suter's an outlier because, yes, he doesn't throw hard, and yes, he's got good command. The angle at which he throws the ball and the way that ball moves is also such an outlier. That pitch isn't really a four-seamer. It's much more of a cutter anyways.
Yeah.
It's just you can't really use those examples either because there's all kinds of things going
Suter
on
also
here.
had Tommy John.
He did, but I'm not going to bring that one up because like they have shown already from this data that if you throw harder,
Yeah, no,
there is more risk. So I'm not going to use that to disprove that or poke holes in that, but there are no good answers to this, man. And I have a hard time seeing how it's going to change at the pro level. I will say the younger you get, I do believe there's a very serious problem with we're trying way too hard to develop kids when they're way too young.
Yes.
That is a real problem. I don't want to see a bunch of high schoolers who are already throwing almost 100 miles an hour. That's not good for them. A lot of these guys have not finished fully growing into their bodies. They're not fully developed yet. That's not good for them to be going and trying to max out their bodies already at that age. That's a completely different issue in my mind from what we're seeing in the pros. And I do think at that level too, there's a better or a greater possibility that you can disincentivize that a little bit. Like if you're high school level competition is not professional level competition. You don't need to throw 100 to high school players to get them out.
No.
I understand that, you know, you want to get drafted and all this. But at the same time, I do think MLB can help a little bit on this front too, because scouts are still a thing. You can scout a guy's body type. You can scout if he has the potential to develop more velocity. I think that there is a way to place a little bit more emphasis on that, saying, hey, we can recognize if you still have room to grow. We don't need to see that 110% right now.
Mm-hmm.
I think there is a way to do that. I don't know exactly, you know, what all the moving parts would entail, but I do think it's a lot more realistic to do something like that than it is to say for MLB pitchers, hey, best hitters in the world, take something off. That's not going to work. It's just not. But I think the further down you get on the competitive scale, on the competition level, I do think it becomes a little bit more practical. But the reality is this is the way it is at MLB. Guys are trying their hardest to get guys out. And the reality is, generally speaking, it gets easier to get guys out the harder you throw. You can get away with more mistakes. You won't get away with every mistake. You know, that's why you can have a guy who throws 100 and a guy who throws 95, and the guy who throws 95 might be better because he's got more command and can sequence better and has secondaries. But then you compare the playing field around. They're still both throwing over 95 miles an hour. Like the velocity is very clearly still a factor that is helping both of these guys a lot. So I think that's something to keep in mind.
Yeah, no, I agree with everything you said. I'm not even going to touch too much on the pro ball portion of things. There was a study a couple years ago that I saw on perfect game tournaments for pre-high school players, usually youth, not even like some of them weren't even middle school. We're talking about guys who are just learning how to pitch. And basically, perfect game tournaments are supposed to be a 3 inning limit per weekend or 4 inning or something at that level. And no one was policing this. So teams were just using the same guy over and over and over because he was their best pitcher and he was going to help them win this perfect game tournament, U10 perfect game tournament. Like they have to, that's where I think it starts. Like these kids, not only are they all, everyone who pitches at that level also plays an infield or an outfield spot and makes a bunch of throws. As a kid, that's the time when your arm is the most vulnerable because you are growing and your ligaments don't grow at the same rate as like your actual body does. So a lot of times the maturity into like that type of stuff doesn't happen until end of high school, really when you're going to college a lot of times. That's what this study actually pointed out a little bit is that this is the case and that high school aged kids are actually having more injuries because they believe it's kind of tied to the youth baseball stuff. And I do too. I really think there's a problem at the youth level with one, everybody has to be on a tryout team. Everybody needs to play select ball right away. Like right when you start getting into pitching, you have to do this. But you also play little league and you also go do all these other things. Like kids don't need to do that. Kids should be having fun playing baseball when they are honestly all the way into high school. It should be a fun thing for them to do. Yeah, you can work on fundamentals and you should work on honestly doing things in a healthy format. And you can do that in a competitive format too. You can do that in tournament play. But this extra emphasis on winning a U10 or U11 tournament, like there's no need for that. And it shouldn't even be honestly, I wish tournaments would almost go away from it should just be round robin play and that's it. There's no winner, there's no nobody wins the tournament, nobody loses the tournament, nothing. They don't even have to keep standings at that level. Let them play baseball and just learn how to play the game and do things that way. And that will disincentivize throwing the same kid out there 4 times on a weekend to pitch because it doesn't matter if you win that game. And it shouldn't have had to come to this, but you kind of mentioned the baseball dad syndrome that goes around. That also leads to a lot of like overemphasis on winning at these levels. And there's no need for that. There really is not. And it you can want to win and try to win, but you just have to do it the right way and do it in a way that keeps everybody in a good place health wise. And it's very frustrating to me. I see I coached at the high school level while I was playing in college, and I saw a bunch of guys coming in as freshmen and sophomores, and they're like, "My arm is killing me," and we're like, "You've only thrown a couple innings." They're like, "Yeah, I threw a ton this summer though, or this spring when we were doing spring ball," and I'm like, "Who had you throwing 30 innings in spring? Like, why are we doing that?" And I think the actual high school teams are kind of in some ways they get blamed for this type of stuff, but I really think a lot of this comes to travel ball. And then there's very good value in the treads and the drive lines and all of those types of companies. But I don't think that is something that kids should be worried about when they are coming up through the ranks and like weighted ball stuff should not start early for kids. And if it does, it should be way lighter than what high school and college and pro athletes are using. But a lot of times people don't scale it back. They just put kids on the same program that a 23-year-old is using like that. It just doesn't make sense. And I really think a lot of it, the velo is going to cause stress on the elbow. The spin is going to cause stress on the elbow. When they get to the pros, it's still going to happen no matter what happened prior to that. These guys are going to have injuries pop up because of everything else that happens. But a lot of these guys are ticking time bombs before they ever get to pro ball. And that's the problem. This shouldn't be the case coming in. And like Jack said, it's hard to tell high schoolers that who know that if they're throwing 95, they're going to get drafted this in the draft, like they're going to. It's hard to tell them like No, you don't need to do that. Like we'll project you out and we'll still take you because there's still going to be 100 other high school pitchers who don't follow that lead and still throw as hard as they can, and they end up getting drafted for it. So I don't really know how you kind of peel it back to a point where it isn't incentivized to throw really hard at the lower levels. But I think pre-high school, at the very least, there needs to be a complete, it needs to be de-emphasized completely. Like it should not be a concern for coaches, for kids. It shouldn't be something kids in middle school and elementary school care about at all. They should just be going out there, competing, throwing the ball over the plate. You want the ball put in play at that level more than anything else. It's really hard to peel it back. I know it is, and I think it's going to come down to, one, these tournaments have to keep the rules they have in place or even improve upon them, and they need to police them, and it needs to be enforced, and umpires need to be made aware of, like, that guy pitched. Like, to me, the easiest way to do this is to give the umpires a rundown of what the teams have done in the tournament already and being like, that kid can't pitch. If he tries to put him into pitch, tell him, nope, somebody else has to pitch. Otherwise, I don't know how you can police it, because you can't have these tournaments have 30 fields running at once, which is insane. So there's no tournament director who can just oversee all of this. But yeah, I don't know. I have a lot of thoughts on it that I won't get into. And we got a question from Andrew that basically said you could probably do a whole podcast on this. And I think we absolutely could.
Mm-hmm.
But
maybe we should have.
Yeah, we absolutely could have. But I just don't know where you go from here, because as Jack said, it's what gets outs, and the goal is to get outs, and the goal is to get paid for a lot of these guys too. And this is what gets you paid. And in the end, you kind of deal with the injury because you got to the point you wanted to get to. It got you paid. You made a living off of baseball, and you understand that there's always the risk that the injury could pop up, and you just have to kind of live with it. And I get it from a pitcher's perspective. I was throwing curveballs way too early in my life. I was always trying to max out as hard as I could. I was doing it at Brewers games on the gun in the kids area and then that was with no warm up. That was with nothing.
Yeah, that's the worst feeling in the world when you go in there as a kid, and I would do that too. You just completely cold, try to uncork one as hard as you can. Your shoulder is just going to be sore and stiff and almost numb a little bit for like the next 15 minutes.
Yep.
Not good.
Yeah. And like, to an extent, you almost have to wonder if those types of things need to go away too, because I would bet it actually contributes to some of these kids, because that's the time you really try and throw your hardest. You don't care where it goes. You don't care anything. Like, it's hard. Like, you don't want to peel that back because it's a fun thing to do too. Like, it's just, there's so many things that go into this. I don't know that there is a solution that's feasible at all, but I do know that at the lower levels, we have to be trying to find something that helps the problem. It's never going to be solved, and it won't ever. I guarantee you, no matter what you do at the lower levels, there's going to be major injuries at the MLB level and minor league level, because those guys are going to continue to max out. It's just about trying to lengthen the careers before that happens. It's trying to strengthen the arms so that they're not already in a bad place when they get to pro ball. I think that's where it has to start and really finish, because it's never happening at the pro level. The hitters are too good. I kind of said it jokingly to you, but like, everyone likes to bring up Greg Maddux, who first of all did throw around 92 when he was early in his career. When he was really in his prime, he was throwing in the low 90s. In fact, I've read scouting reports where he was described as somebody who threw hard when he was a prospect, because at that time he did. He also was getting, I said it this way, it was basically working with a 23-inch plate instead of a 17-inch plate. And people can get mad at me for that, but you can go watch video. That zone was huge for probably specifically the Braves, because they had all those guys, and they had that. There were a lot of people I know from that time who believe the Braves got a even bigger zone than usual, but it was a bigger zone to work with. And now with how they grade umpires and everything else, that's never happening again unless they literally expand the plate. Like, I think that's the only way this could ever even be feasible, is if they made the plate bigger. And to be honest, hitters would adjust after a couple of years of that, and it would go right back to being the same thing. Like, it's just, I don't see any way this ever happens at the pro level, but it's not ideal. Nobody wants major injuries for the pitchers. Pitchers don't want major injuries, but I think at that level, they know it's part of the deal, and they know it's a risk that they take. Just like anything else you do in any walk of life, you take risks, and you have to kind of weigh what the reward is with that risk. For major league pitchers, the idea of getting paid, the idea of getting to play on a major stage, and the idea of potentially winning World Series and doing all of these things far outweigh the potential to have an injury. And I will note, just last thing here, in the report, they did talk about, there were a couple doctors who were like, pitchers are too cavalier about saying like, well, I'll just get Tommy John. They're like, it's not that simple. Like, there is risk to getting Tommy John and all of that. But at the same time, I've said it on this podcast, for the most part, Tommy John is almost down to a science. So even for pitchers who know that there's a good chance they're going to get it, most of them correctly, not all of them, but most of them correctly assume that they're still going to get back to where they were eventually and be in the same spot while also still having reaped the rewards that came with it before the injury. So I just don't see how you ever get it back to where this isn't the case. I don't see any path to that.
I wasn't sure if I was going to bring up Maddox, but since you brought him up, I always think that's a fun discussion to have, because you're right. He is like the common example of you can throw 86 with great command and change speeds, and you can still be a really good pitcher. All the things you said are true. When he was in his prime, he was throwing harder than 86. When he actually was throwing 86 at the end of his career, I looked at the numbers. So 2003 to 2008, so his age 37 to 42 seasons, like those last 6 years or so of his career, 4.13 ERA. That was barely above the league average, basically by a tick or two. And that's for a guy who was throwing 86 with a bigger zone than some pitchers, as one of the smartest pitchers who's ever lived, with great command, with all of this stuff. Like, he had all of these other things, like the peak combination to help you overcome not having velocity. And by the time he had no velocity, he was still barely a league average starter. A durable one, to be sure, so there's a lot of value there, but a league average starter, like on a rate basis. When he was at his peak, he still had all those other things, but he could also throw 90 plus, and that matters. I always tell people this. I fully believe Greg Maddux would have had a fantastic peak no matter what era of baseball he played in. If you put peak Maddux into 2024 baseball, even for as good as the hitters are, he still would have been fantastic at his best. Because, again, he had all of these things that are important to good pitching. You need to be smart. You need to know how to sequence. You need to be able to command, and you need to be able to mix speeds, especially if you're going to be a starting pitcher. But if you do not have enough velocity, those things cannot save you from that. You need to have all of that. You need to have that complete package. That's what makes you a very good pitcher. And Greg Maddux, for a good chunk of his career, he did have more of that velocity. And guess what? It also did help that he had massive strike zones. You go back and you watch a Greg Maddux start. I'll give him credit because he knew he would get these calls. And that was him hitting spots. So I do believe if he pitched today, he could have adjusted a little bit and adjusted to that smaller zone and hit what are considered the corners now. He still could have done that. But guess what? His job also does get a little easier when he's getting calls that are over the chalk of the batter's box, even though the frame job is god-awful. It's always funny to go back and watch some of those old games, too, because you could tell catcher framing was not really a quantifiable value thing like it is now, because some of the receiving you see in those games, it's terrible. It's just a product of the times more than anything. But still, it's fun to watch that as well. But, yeah, I mean, everything we've talked about, I think the good way to sum it up is just, again, you absolutely need to be able to do other things than throw hard, especially if you want to be a consistently successful big league bulk pitcher. But throwing hard is a very important part of that mix. I would say, generally speaking, throwing hard is going to do more for you than commanding and sequencing is going to. That's not saying that you're going to automatically succeed with velocity if you don't have those other things. But if we're talking about how much everything contributes to your success, I would rank velocity ahead of some of these other attributes that are also very important for the best pitchers in the world. And because velocity is that important to getting big league hitters out, again, the numbers show you get more hitters out with velocity and more spin. This is not debatable. And so long as that is the case, which it's probably always going to be the case, you need your best stuff to get guys out the most consistently. You can't disincentivize throwing hard. You just can't. There's no way to do it. So it's always going to be a thing at the pro level. But I think the farther you get down the ladder,
Yes,
especially when you're getting into like youth and even early high school, there I think there is a more feasible way to start emphasizing natural development as guys age. So you're not overloading them and pushing their bodies to the limits earlier than you need to. I think there is a way to do that. And I think there is a way to, at those levels, emphasize pitchability and some other elements of that stuff. I think there's a way to build pitchers in a way that's not risk-free, because as long as you throw that hard, there's going to be quite a bit of risk.
Yeah.
But I think there's a better way to do it than we do it now. And this also extends to the minor leagues as well. One of the findings of this study was that minor league pitchers, they have cut down the workload for those guys so significantly that when they get to the big leagues, it's such a massive ramp up for them that their bodies really just are not ready to handle that jump. So I think we can do a better job of that as well. Gradually build up innings more for guys in the minor leagues instead of trying to shield them and save their bullets for the big leagues. It feels like that's what a lot of teams are doing. I think you can do that as well. But the youth level is really where it needs to start. And I think that's really where you can, if you get a concentrated effort going, you can make some positive changes there. You know, I can remember this like as recently as last year. So I do, you know, analytics for a college team and pitch design stuff and all of this for a college team. It's a big part of, you know, what I focus on when I cover the Brewers. I put a lot of it in my work. That's how I evaluate players. I love this stuff. I think it's incredibly valuable. But I've had like high school coaches, even youth coaches say to me like, yeah, I'm thinking about incorporating, you know, like some advanced stats or even like some Rapsodo or some TrackMan stuff for my high school, like my high school team, my JV high school team, my freshman team, or like my U13 team. What are some things that I should be looking at? And I always say nothing.
Yeah.
You don't need this. And I'm saying this as someone who loves this stuff. I eat this stuff up at the pro level and even at the college level. But when they're that young in that playing environment, it's going to do more harm than good. You don't need it. Just let the kids play. Let things play out. You don't need to, you know, overstimulate guys. You don't need to overcomplicate things at that level. Just go out and play baseball. Let these guys mature. And then I think if you do the development right, first of all, you also got to stop. Part of the reason I think people want to enact this stuff is I think they think that if they use it super early on, that's going to allow them to turn their kid into a future pro. The odds of your kid becoming a pro, it's like what point? It's well below like 1%. It's like a crazy. I don't even know how many zeros.
0.00 at least.
I don't even know how many zeros are in front of that one in that percentage, but it's so low that it's not worth it. If your kid is naturally that gifted and you teach him to love the game, it'll happen.
Mm-hmm.
And that it's very unlikely because your kid probably just is not that kid. He almost certainly is not that kid. So just let these kids develop, let them develop a love for the game. And if they actually are that good and you teach them how to develop in a safe, responsible, healthy way, and we get, you know, everybody on board with this and understanding that there is a more natural progression for when we have these guys start maxing out, I think that can be very productive for the game and very productive, particularly for the health of youth baseball players. Again, I don't know if there's really a way to fix this in the big leagues, but I really do think the farther down you get, there are far more responsible and far more nuanced ways that you can handle this that are going to minimize that injury risk for guys and make more people happy. Not a perfect solution, but I think there's a way that it can be better.
100%.
I think that's a good note to end on. Again, we really should have done a whole podcast about this because I do think there is quite a bit to unpack there. But we have already taken more than enough time on this episode. thank you all for tuning in. If you made it this far, or even if you chose to, I don't know, divide up the podcast into chunks throughout the week and you choose to listen that way, that's probably how I would do it. But if you made it this far, thank you. We won't be back with you all until after the holidays. So stay safe. Enjoy your holiday. And we'll see you in a couple weeks. Go Brewers.